If you are hearing this message right now, stay with it for a moment, because there is a reason these words may feel strangely connected to what you have been experiencing lately. Or the story centers on someone whose name begins with the letter J, Ati, and the claim being made is that this person has been directing a great deal of negative energy toward you, while believing you would never recognize what was happening. According to the message, this person believed they had damaged your confidence and drained your strength without anyone noticing. But the script frames your recent exhaustion, confusion, emotional heaviness as signs that something deeper has been happening beneath the surface. And it suggests that everything done in secret has been seen by heaven. And the first thing you are asked to notice is how your energy has felt recently. Perhaps you wake up exhausted, even after sleeping through the night. Or you suddenly feel an unusual heaviness in your shoulders without understanding where it came from. Maybe you enter a familiar place and immediately feel that you need to leave, while your intuition tells you something is wrong, even though you cannot explain it logically. The transcript interprets these experiences as signs of a spiritual attack, describing them as a targeted extraction of your energy rather than ordinary fatigue. It presents you as someone with a naturally strong and positive presence, someone whose inner light attracts people who may not know how to create that same sense of peace for themselves. That is where the person identified by the initial J enters the story. Body. The message claims that they recognized something in you that they did not believe they possessed themselves. So instead of building their own strength, they attempted to draw from yours. What makes the situation especially difficult, according to the transcript, is that they did not appear openly hostile. They may have approached you as a friend, partner, or someone who genuinely needed your support. You responded with empathy, patience, and understanding. But in return, the message says, they brought their unresolved pain into your life and repeatedly relied on your emotional strength. Whenever you tried to establish boundaries, they allegedly made you feel guilty for doing so. Over time, you may have started wondering why you felt completely exhausted after interacting with them. And the transcript describes this as the consequence of carrying someone else's emotional and spiritual burden for far too long. But the message emphasizes that your exhaustion should not be interpreted as personal failure. It tells you that you were simply acting from kindness and empathy, giving people the benefit of the doubt, because that is naturally how you approach those who are hurting. The problem, according to this narrative, is that your kindness was taken advantage of. Body and mind supposedly began reacting to the constant pressure, creating sudden drops in energy, mental fog, and an unexplained sense that something was wrong whenever this person entered your thoughts or surroundings. Transcript then expands this idea by claiming that what happens in the spiritual realm eventually affects the physical world. It suggests that when someone focuses negative intentions on you, your intuition and inner awareness respond by warning you, even when your logical mind cannot immediately identify the reason. That could explain why you may have felt increasingly isolated. People you once trusted may have become distant, relationships may have changed unexpectedly, and you may have wondered why life suddenly seemed much harder than before. But within the message's spiritual interpretation, that isolation was not punishment. Instead, it was protection. The universe is described as creating distance between you and harmful influences so that your energy could recover without continued interference. The person with the initial J supposedly felt threatened by your presence because your character exposed things within them that they did not want to confront. rather than facing those issues themselves. The transcript claims they attempted to make you smaller. They wanted you to doubt your instincts, question your decisions, and eventually believe that you were the source of the problem. Message says this person smiled in your face while quietly creating doubt behind your back. Match in. They allegedly tried to interfere with opportunities connected to your future, and even attempted to prevent blessings from reaching you and your family line. Yet, the central argument is that they overlooked something important. They underestimated the protection surrounding you. Or the transcript repeatedly frames your situation as one in which heaven has been observing what happened, even while you believed you were fighting the battle alone. Now, the message says, that situation is changing. The protection this person believed they had is supposedly disappearing, while the trap they created for you is beginning to turn against them. You are told to breathe deeply and release the heaviness you have been carrying, because you no longer need to fight this unseen battle yourself. According to the narrative, the universe has already intervened, and the period of confusion and emotional exhaustion caused by this relationship is approaching its end. But there is another important warning. Even if the separation has begun, you are told to protect your boundaries while this transition takes place. As the message insists that the person with the initial J is becoming increasingly concerned because they can sense that you are no longer giving them the same access to your attention and emotional energy. For too long, you have supposedly been functioning while completely exhausted. You continued showing up for your family, handling your responsibilities, and appearing fine on the outside even while feeling deeply tired internally. The transcript connects that fatigue directly to the relationship with Jay, claiming that this person recognized your empathy and deliberately took advantage of it. It describes people like this as dependent on the energy of those around them because they refuse to develop their own emotional strength. You may have noticed that after spending time with this person, your normal personality seemed to disappear. You struggled to think clearly, felt emotionally empty, and wondered why someone who was supposed to be close to you left you feeling so depleted. Message insists that this was more than ordinary social exhaustion. It describes it as a form of calculated spiritual theft and tells you not to dismiss the uncomfortable feelings you experienced around this person. Most importantly, it tells you to stop blaming yourself. You are not portrayed as weak because you trusted someone. Instead, your willingness to forgive and understand others is presented as a strength that was simply placed in the wrong hands. The transcript then introduces a larger explanation for why this person supposedly chose you. It describes you as a cycle breaker, someone carrying the potential to end harmful patterns that have existed within your family for generations. According to this spiritual narrative, Jay sensed that strength and felt threatened by it. They could not rise alongside you, so they attempted to pull you down to where they felt comfortable. Yet the message argues that they made one serious mistake. They underestimated how much strength you had developed through everything you had already survived. And that brings us to the secret. The transcript says Jay is most afraid you will discover. The claim is that this person did not target you because you were weak or broken. They targeted you precisely because they recognized qualities in you that they felt were missing in themselves. And they allegedly wanted you to believe that you were overly sensitive, incapable, or somehow responsible for the problems between you. But beneath that behavior, the narrative says, was fear that you would eventually recognize your own worth and walk away. Once you understood that, their control over you would begin to disappear. And according to the message, That realization is exactly what is happening now. The moment you begin to recognize what happened, the entire dynamic starts to change. According to the message, the person with the initial J depended heavily on your reactions, your attention, and your emotional responses, because those reactions gave them a sense of control. As long as you remained angry, confused, hurt, or constantly trying to understand them, they still had a connection to your emotional world. But when you stopped responding in the same way, something important happened. You began taking your energy back, and the person who once seemed so powerful in your life suddenly had far less influence over you. And the transcript describes this silence as one of the strongest things you could have done, because you stopped providing the emotional reaction they had come to depend on. That does not mean you are expected to pretend that nothing happened. You are allowed to feel angry about the way you were treated, especially if you spent a long time questioning yourself while someone else continued crossing your boundaries. The message interprets that anger as a form of protection, a signal that something inside you has finally decided that enough is enough. It says that your sensitivity was never the weakness this person tried to make you believe it was. In fact, or your ability to notice subtle changes in people, environments, and relationships may have helped you recognize that something was wrong long before you had the words to explain it. The transcript repeatedly returns to the idea that Jay underestimated you. They assumed your patience meant you would tolerate anything, and they interpreted your silence as weakness. But what they failed to understand was that your silence could also mean that you were observing, learning, and eventually choosing not to participate in the same cycle anymore. Now the story moves toward what the message calls divine justice. It claims that the energy this person directed toward you is beginning to reverse, and that the consequences of their actions are returning to them. The language is spiritual rather than something that can be independently verified. But within the narrative, this is presented as the moment when the balance finally begins to shift. The person who believed they had won supposedly only won a temporary battle. They may have succeeded in creating confusion for a while, but the message insists that they could not permanently destroy what made you strong. Your ability to continue moving forward despite everything is presented as the clearest evidence that their plan failed. This is also where the transcript reveals what it calls the deeper secret behind Jay's behavior. It claims that they were afraid you would eventually recognize that much of their confidence was an illusion. Behind the arrogance, criticism, and attempts to make you feel small, the narrative portrays someone who was deeply insecure about your strength. That is why, according to the message, they repeatedly criticized your decisions and questioned your dreams. They wanted to create the impression that they were more important, more capable, or more powerful than you. And if you believed that version of reality, they could maintain control. But the message argues that this was only an illusion. And they did not need to defeat you directly if they could convince you to doubt yourself. Making you question your instincts would have been enough to keep you dependent on their approval. This is why the transcript tells you to stop making excuses for behavior that repeatedly hurts you. Compassion does not require unlimited access, and forgiveness does not mean allowing someone to continue crossing the same boundary again and again. Your kindness, according to the message, became something this person tried to exploit. You kept forgiving them because you naturally wanted to believe there was something worth saving in the relationship. Eventually, you had to understand that you cannot force someone to change simply by giving them more of yourself. The separation between you and Jay is therefore presented as necessary. Transcript describes it as a clearing process where the space once occupied by confusion, conflict, and emotional exhaustion can finally become available for something healthier. The isolation you experienced is again given a spiritual interpretation. Rather than being evidence that you had been abandoned, the message describes it as a temporary period of protection, a time when you were separated from certain influences so that you could recover your sense of direction. Every difficult moment is framed as part of your transformation. The tears you shed privately are described as preparing the ground for something better, while the pain you endured is portrayed as forcing you to recognize your own strength. The message then makes a major transition. It says that you are no longer the person Jay believed they could manipulate. You have learned to recognize unhealthy patterns, establish boundaries, and stop giving unlimited access to people who repeatedly make you feel smaller. But there is a warning that comes with this transformation. Even after you separate from someone, the emotional habits created during that relationship can remain. You may continue expecting another problem to appear, even when the immediate danger or conflict is gone. That is why the transcript encourages you to remain grounded instead of constantly waiting for the next attack. Your future should not be controlled by fear of what someone else might do. The purpose of leaving an unhealthy cycle is to create enough distance that you can finally experience life without constantly reacting to another person's behavior. The message uses the image of a lighthouse to explain this idea. When someone has a strong presence, they naturally attract people who are searching for direction. But not everyone who approaches the light wants to build their own path. Some people may simply want to depend on what someone else has already created. Jay is described as one of those people. According to the narrative, they saw qualities in you that they wanted but were unwilling to develop themselves. Instead of doing the difficult internal work, they attempted to make your confidence smaller so that their own insecurity would feel less obvious. That is why the transcript says they treated you with a confusing mixture of praise and criticism. One moment, they could make you feel appreciated, and the next, they could undermine your confidence with a subtle insult. This constant push and pull kept you uncertain about where you stood with them. You may have repeatedly asked yourself why you continued returning to the relationship even after recognizing the pattern. The message says the answer is not that there was something wrong with you. You kept returning because you genuinely wanted to believe that things could improve. Your instinct was to repair what was broken. Eventually, you had to recognize that healing another person is not your responsibility when they refuse to take responsibility for themselves. The transcript presents this realization as one of the most important lessons you have learned. It then returns to the idea of generational cycles. You are described as someone who has the opportunity to stop patterns that have continued through your family. And the conflict with Jay is presented as one of the tests that forced you to develop stronger boundaries. In this interpretation, Jay became a kind of Trojan horse, appearing as an ordinary connection while bringing problems into your life that you did not immediately recognize. But once their intentions became clearer, the message says the illusion could no longer survive. And now Jay is supposedly becoming afraid because they can feel your attention moving away from them. Their confidence, according to the transcript, depended partly on knowing they could still provoke a response from you. When that response disappeared, their influence weakened. The message claims they began searching for new ways to get your attention, because without your emotional involvement, they no longer had the same access to your life. This is where the narrative begins shifting away from what Jay did and toward what happens after you stop participating. The transcript says that your greatest victory is not watching someone else suffer. It is reaching a point where their actions no longer determine how you feel, how you live, or where you are going. That distinction matters because the message repeatedly warns you not to become consumed by revenge. You do not need to chase them, expose them, or prove anything to them. Matthew, your responsibility is to protect your peace and continue moving forward. The transcript then describes this as the beginning of a reversal. The person who once tried to isolate you is supposedly losing control of the story they created, while the people around them may begin noticing inconsistencies in their behavior. Every false impression they created is described as eventually becoming harder to maintain. The narrative calls this the law of reflection, suggesting that the energy and behavior someone puts into the world eventually returns to them in some form. Whether understood spiritually or simply as the natural consequences of harmful behavior, the central message remains the same. You do not have to personally deliver justice. You can step away and allow consequences to unfold without becoming part of the conflict. The story now reaches the point where Jay's carefully constructed image begins to crack. The person who wanted you to feel powerless, supposedly, starts facing the consequences of losing access to your attention, while you begin rebuilding the confidence they tried to weaken. And according to the transcript, that is only the beginning. The next stage is described as the moment when the trap Jay allegedly created for you begins turning back toward the person who created it, revealing just how much of their apparent control depended on keeping you confused. The message now reaches the point where the story turns completely around. According to the narrative, Adam, the person with the initial J, believed they had carefully constructed a situation that would isolate you, weaken your confidence, and leave you questioning your own judgment. But the same circumstances are now described as beginning to work against them. The transcript claims that Jay spent months building a story about you and quietly sharing information designed to influence how other people viewed you. The goal, according to the message, was to make you feel alone and convince you that nobody would believe your side of the story. But the narrative argues that this strategy could not last forever. Lies require constant maintenance. And once people begin noticing contradictions between what someone says and how they actually behave, the image they created can start falling apart. The message describes this as spiritual reflection, behavior Jay directed toward you and eventually returns to their own life. The anxiety and uncertainty that once followed you are portrayed as becoming part of their experience, while the isolation they tried to create around you supposedly begins surrounding them instead. The transcript goes even further, Matthew claiming that Jay can sense something changing but does not understand how to stop it. They once believed they had complete control over the situation, yet now they are supposedly realizing that your silence was not surrender. Your silence was distance, and that distance removed the emotional access they once had. The story repeatedly emphasizes that you did not need to fight them publicly. You did not need to expose every detail or spend your life proving what happened. By refusing to continue feeding the conflict, you allowed the situation to reveal itself through its own consequences. According to the spiritual interpretation of the transcript, Jay's negative intentions could not permanently reach you because you were protected. It describes your inner strength as a kind of spiritual shield, suggesting that whatever negativity was directed toward you eventually returned to its source. The narrative then claims that Jay's financial opportunities, relationships, Plans are beginning to experience difficulties. Things they once considered secure are supposedly becoming uncertain. And the person who believed they could control everything is now struggling to maintain the same sense of stability. But the deeper point is not simply that their circumstances are changing. The message says that Jay built too much of their identity around controlling other people. And when that control disappeared, they were forced to confront parts of themselves they had been avoiding. That is why the transcript describes their confidence as beginning to collapse. When you stopped reacting, they lost one of the main sources of validation they had depended on. The message then returns to your own silence. For a long time, Jay supposedly interpreted your lack of retaliation as evidence that they had won. They believed that because you were not fighting back, you were powerless, but the narrative gives that silence an entirely different meaning. You were waiting, whether consciously or unconsciously, for the situation to reveal itself without sacrificing your own peace in the process. Instead of trying to control the outcome, you stepped away. And according to the message, that decision created the space for consequences to unfold naturally. The transcript describes this as the moment when Jay's carefully designed trap begins closing around them. They allegedly wanted to create a pit of isolation for you, hoping that you would lose your confidence and disappear from the lives of people around you. Yet the narrative claims that they eventually found themselves surrounded by the same isolation they had tried to create for someone else. The people they influenced may begin questioning their behavior, and the story they built about you may become increasingly difficult to defend. The message presents this as the collapse of a false victim narrative. Jay supposedly wanted others to believe that they were the one who had been mistreated. But once the contradictions became visible, the story could no longer protect them. At the same time, you are portrayed as becoming increasingly unavailable to manipulation. You no longer explain yourself endlessly, no longer chase approval, and no longer feel obligated to convince everyone that your intentions were good. That change is presented as one of the strongest signs that the cycle is ending. A person who once occupied so much of your mental and emotional space is gradually losing that position. The transcript then describes Jay as realizing that they have permanently lost access to something they once took for granted: your attention, compassion, and willingness to keep trying. According to the narrative, they may remember moments when you treated them with genuine kindness and realize that they did not appreciate what they had. Message uses the image of someone throwing away something valuable while chasing things that were far less meaningful. But the most important part is that you do not need to return. Even if Jay regrets what happened, the transcript makes it clear that your future should not depend on whether they finally understand their mistakes. The story now moves toward what it calls the final phase of the conflict. The person who once appeared powerful is supposedly being forced to face the consequences of their own choices, while you are finally stepping away from the role of constantly defending yourself. The message says that you survived the hardest part because you refused to become like the person who hurt you. You did not choose revenge as your identity, and you did not allow their behavior to transform you into someone consumed by bitterness. It becomes especially important because the transcript presents your greatest victory as maintaining your character. You experience betrayal, confusion, and emotional exhaustion, yet the message insists that your core remained intact. You bent under pressure, but you did not completely break. And that resilience is described as the very thing Jay feared most, because it proved that their attempts to control you had failed. The narrative then describes the separation as permanent. Hope. Jay is portrayed as having lost their place in your life, while you are supposedly entering a completely different chapter. But instead of focusing only on what is being removed, message asks you to consider what becomes possible when that space finally opens. For a long time, your attention was consumed by someone else's problems. You were constantly trying to understand their behavior, repair the relationship, manage their emotions, and protect yourself from the next conflict. Now that connection is gone. The transcript describes the empty space left behind as something valuable. It is not presented as loneliness, but as room for something new. Message compares your life to a vessel that has finally been emptied of what was weighing it down. According to this spiritual framing, new blessings cannot fully enter while all your attention remains occupied by old conflicts. That is why the transcript begins shifting toward abundance. It claims that the energy you once spent surviving difficult relationships can now be redirected toward your own future, your own goals, and the people who genuinely support you. The message describes this next period as a transition from fighting to receiving. You are no longer expected to remain in survival mode or constantly prepare for another confrontation. Instead, you are encouraged to learn what peace feels like. That may sound simple, but the transcript acknowledges that peace can feel unfamiliar after a long period of instability. When your mind becomes accustomed to expecting another problem, even a quiet moment can make you wonder when something will go wrong. The narrative therefore encourages you not to mistake calm for danger. Absence of conflict does not mean another conflict is secretly forming. This is where your boundaries become especially important. Message says that you no longer need to give unlimited access to people simply because you feel responsible for their healing. Your empathy remains valuable, but it should no longer come at the cost of your own stability. You can care about someone without allowing them to control your emotional world. Or the transcript then expands the idea of abundance beyond money. It talks about emotional peace, healthier relationships, opportunities, and a stronger sense of self. Presenting all of these as forms of prosperity that become possible once the old cycle ends. It claims that the people entering your life next will not demand that you become smaller to make them comfortable. Instead, they will appreciate your personality, respect your boundaries, and allow you to exist without constantly questioning your worth. This new environment is described as a spiritual community that matches your energy. But the deeper lesson is about choosing relationships where mutual respect exists instead of one-sided emotional dependence. The transcript then returns to the idea of generational healing. It describes you as someone who has broken a pattern that may have continued for a long time, suggesting that the lessons you learned through this painful relationship can prevent similar cycles from continuing into the future. 1. Your experience with Jay is therefore framed not simply as something that happened to you, but as something that taught you where your boundaries need to stand. Narrative insists that you are not returning to the same version of yourself. You have learned how to recognize manipulation, how to trust your instincts, how to protect your peace without feeling guilty. Now, however, the message says that one final step remains. You must stop looking backward and consciously decide that the old cycle no longer has permission to define your future. The transcript calls this closing the energetic door behind you. In practical terms, message is asking you to stop reopening situations that have already shown you what they are. Your future cannot fully begin if you continue measuring every new relationship against the person who hurt you. At some point, Healing means allowing the past to become the past rather than carrying it into every new chapter. The story then builds toward its final message of transformation. You survived the experience, learned from it, and reached the point where you can finally begin receiving something different. And according to the transcript, what comes next is not another battle. It is the beginning of a season where your attention can finally return to your own life, your own peace, and the future you were unable to see clearly while you were still trapped inside the conflict. Message now moves into the chapter that begins after the conflict has finally lost its power over you. The person with the initial J may have occupied a huge amount of your attention for a long time, but the transcript says that space is no longer theirs to control. What once felt like an endless spiritual battle is being reframed as a lesson that prepared you to protect your peace and recognize what truly deserves access to your life. The first thing you are being asked to understand is that peace may feel unfamiliar after living through constant emotional tension. If you spent months expecting another argument, another disappointment, or another attempt to manipulate you, your mind may continue preparing for conflict even when there is no immediate threat. The message encourages you to release that habit and allow yourself to recognize that calm does not automatically mean something bad is coming. According to the transcript, this is where the transformation becomes visible. You are no longer being described as someone who must constantly fight to protect yourself, but as someone who has learned when to put the sword down. The difficult experiences with Jay supposedly taught you that strength does not always mean confronting another person. Sometimes strength means refusing to return to the same cycle. The space Jay once occupied is now described as sacred ground. Instead of filling that space with more arguments, explanations, or attempts to understand their motives, message says you can use it to rebuild your own life. The empty space is not a punishment or evidence that something is missing. It is presented as an opportunity to create relationships, goals, and experiences that are not controlled by the past. The transcript then introduces the idea of abundance. It claims that the blessings Jay attempted to interfere with are now returning, describing the coming period as one of financial and emotional growth. While these spiritual promises are part of the message's belief system rather than something that can be guaranteed, the central theme is clear. The energy once spent surviving a difficult relationship can now be invested in building a healthier future. You are encouraged to stop thinking only about what you lost and begin noticing what has become possible. Opportunities that once seemed blocked may appear again. The message says the most important change is internal. You're beginning to believe that you deserve peace without having to earn it through suffering or sacrifice. The transcript also warns you not to carry the old relationship into every new connection. When someone has repeatedly crossed your boundaries, it can become easy to expect the same behavior from everyone else. As it says, your next chapter requires you to recognize the difference between genuine connection and relationships built around manipulation, guilt, or emotional exhaustion. It describes a future in which healthier people enter your life and appreciate you without demanding that you become smaller. Instead of being valued only for what you can provide emotionally, you are encouraged to build relationships where support moves in both directions and where your boundaries are treated with respect. This is also connected to the transcript's larger idea of breaking generational patterns. It presents you as someone who has interrupted a cycle that may have existed for generations, not because you were never hurt, but because you decided that the pain would not determine what happened next. Your experience becomes meaningful when you use what you learn to make different choices in the future. The message says that you have spent too long acting as the person who rescues everyone else. You naturally wanted to help broken people understand their pain and give them another chance. But the experience with Jay supposedly taught you that compassion without boundaries can leave you completely depleted. You can still care deeply without taking responsibility for another person's healing. That distinction becomes essential as the narrative moves toward your new identity. You are no longer expected to prove your goodness by tolerating mistreatment. You do not have to convince someone to respect you, and you do not need to remain available simply because you once cared about them. The transcript describes this as receiving rather than fighting. Instead of constantly giving your energy away, you are being encouraged to become comfortable, accepting support, appreciation, opportunity, and peace. Message portrays this shift as a major spiritual upgrade because it requires you to believe that good things can enter your life without being followed by another painful sacrifice. But there is still an important internal battle to overcome. Even after Jay is gone, the memory of what happened can continue influencing your decisions. You may become suspicious of people who have done nothing wrong, or you may feel guilty whenever you establish a boundary because you have been conditioned to associate boundaries with rejection. Message therefore urges you to stop apologizing for protecting yourself. Your energy, attention, and time are presented as valuable resources, and you are no longer expected to give them freely to people who repeatedly misuse them. The transcript then returns to the idea that every difficult experience has prepared you for this moment. And it describes your resilience as something forged through hardship, suggesting that the pressure you survived revealed strengths you might never have discovered under easier circumstances. You are told that this is your moment of validation, not because someone else has been defeated, but because you have reached a point where their behavior no longer determines your identity. The person who once made you question yourself is no longer the authority over how you see your own worth. From there, the message turns toward the future with even greater confidence. It describes a coming period of favor, prosperity, emotional stability, and new opportunities, again presenting these as part of the spiritual message rather than guaranteed outcomes. The important shift is that you are being encouraged to imagine a future that is larger than the conflict you just survived. You are also warned to protect that future by refusing to return to old patterns. If someone repeatedly proves that they cannot respect your boundaries, you do not need another 100 explanations before taking action. The lesson has already been delivered through their behavior. The transcript calls this graduation from a difficult karmic lesson. You are no longer presented as the person trapped inside the story, constantly reacting to what Jay does next. Instead, you become the person deciding what happens next in your own life. This is why the message asks you to let the feeling of security settle into your mind. You have spent so much time watching for hidden problems that you may have forgotten what it feels like to simply move through life without constantly scanning for another threat. Now, the narrative says, you can walk forward without carrying the same armor. The painful chapter is described as closing, and the next chapter is supposed to be defined by freedom rather than fear. For a long time, you were portrayed as the stepping stone for people who needed your strength but did not respect it. But the transcript insists that role has ended. You are now being encouraged to shine without apologizing, to pursue your goals without shrinking yourself, and to stop making your life smaller just to keep another person comfortable. The message then reaches one final requirement before the transformation can be complete. You must consciously close the door behind you. That means refusing to reopen the same unhealthy connection, refusing to chase explanations that will never satisfy you, and refusing to allow the past to determine the boundaries of your future. Your transformation is presented as something that can influence more than just your own life. The transcript calls you a cycle breaker whose choices may affect future generations. Because changing the way you respond to unhealthy relationships can prevent those same patterns from being repeated. And as the message prepares to reach its final stage, it returns to the promise that the hardship you experienced will not be the end of your story. The pain may have shaped you, but it does not have to define you. What comes next is supposed to be a life in which your energy is no longer spent defending yourself from the past, but building the future you were always trying to reach. The final stage of this message is about claiming the life that begins after the old cycle has ended. The person with the initial J may have played a major role in the painful chapter you just experienced. A transcript insists that their place in your future is now finished. You are no longer being asked to fight, explain, prove, or defend yourself against them because the focus has finally returned to where it belongs. Your own life. The message describes this as the beginning of a new inheritance, not simply in material terms. Through peace, confidence, healthier relationships, and the freedom to make decisions without constantly worrying about another person's reaction. You are encouraged to understand that walking away from a destructive cycle is not losing something valuable. Sometimes it is the moment you finally make room for what you actually need. The transcript says that your days of making yourself smaller to keep difficult people comfortable are over. You no longer have to sacrifice your dreams, silence your instincts, or question your worth simply because someone else feels threatened by your growth. The future being described is one in which you can exist openly, pursue what matters to you, and allow the right people to appreciate you without demanding that you become someone else. But the message emphasizes that this transformation requires a decision from you. You must consciously close the door on the old pattern and refuse to keep reopening it through constant attention, resentment, or the desire for revenge. The past may have happened, but you do not have to keep giving it new power every time you revisit it. The transcript describes this as closing an energetic portal, using spiritual language to express a very practical idea. Not continue giving emotional access to someone who repeatedly proved that they could not handle it responsibly. If J no longer has a place in your life, then your future does not need to remain organized around what they might do next. Your transformation is then presented as something larger than one relationship. Message describes you as a cycle breaker whose experience may help prevent similar patterns from continuing through your family. By learning to establish boundaries, recognize manipulation, and protect your emotional well-being, you are supposedly changing more than your own story. The transcript also returns to the idea that you have carried an enormous burden. You gave empathy even when it was not appreciated, remained compassionate when you had every reason to become bitter, and continued moving forward despite experiences that made you question yourself. Message portrays that resilience as one of your greatest victories. It says that every tear and every difficult moment has contributed to the strength you now possess. And rather than allowing pain to harden your character, you supposedly learned from it without losing your ability to care. That becomes the real measure of your transformation. You survived something difficult without allowing the experience to turn you into the kind of person who caused the pain in the first place. The transcript then describes your future as protected from the influence of J. Again, these spiritual claims cannot be independently established as facts, but within the message, Aaron, they represent the belief that your boundaries can prevent the same person from having the same influence over you again. You are told that you no longer need to constantly look over your shoulder. You can move forward without analyzing every room, every conversation, or every new person for signs of hidden danger. The goal is not to become unaware, but to become confident enough in your boundaries that you no longer need to live in constant anticipation of betrayal. As this is also why the message says your empathy should not be treated as something you need to eliminate. Your ability to care is still valuable. What changes is who receives that care and whether the relationship allows you to receive the same respect and consideration in return. The transcript describes this next chapter as a period of compensation, claiming that the energy and opportunities you lost are returning in a greater form. Again, this is a spiritual promise within the original narrative. Not a guarantee of future events, but its emotional message is straightforward. Your difficult past does not mean your future must remain difficult. People may eventually look at your life and wonder how you found such a strong sense of peace. They may see only the result and not understand the experiences that forced you to develop stronger boundaries and greater self-awareness. Message says you will know exactly what it took to reach that point. You did not find peace because everything became perfect. You found it because you stopped allowing another person's behavior to control your inner world. The transcript then asks you to make a declaration of victory by writing the words, "I claim my absolute victory," in the comments. Within the spiritual framework of the message, after this is described as a symbolic declaration that you are closing the old chapter and committing yourself to the new one. The deeper meaning is that you are publicly acknowledging a decision to move forward. Instead of defining yourself through what Jay did, you are defining yourself through what you choose to do next. Message then encourages you to remain connected to a community of people who share the same spiritual outlook. It asks viewers to follow the page and remain part of that community, presenting the collective as a source of protection and shared strength. But regardless of whether someone accepts the spiritual claims in the message literally, the central lesson remains focused on boundaries and self-respect. You do not need to remain emotionally connected to people who repeatedly make you feel unsafe, exhausted, or uncertain about your own value. The transcript closes by reminding you that you were brought to this message for a reason, according to its spiritual perspective. It tells you that you are safe. The painful chapter involving Jay is closed, and that you can finally step into the future without carrying the same fear. The final image is one of complete transition. The battlefield is quiet. Old conflict has ended, and you are no longer standing in the same emotional position where the story began. The person who once seemed capable of controlling your peace has become part of the past, while your attention is directed toward what comes next. You are encouraged to take a deep breath and allow yourself to imagine a future built around peace rather than constant defense. The message does not ask you to forget what happened or pretend that the experience was insignificant. Instead, asks you to recognize that surviving a painful relationship does not mean you have to remain connected to it forever. Your next chapter, according to the transcript, is supposed to be defined by abundance, healthier relationships, emotional freedom, and a renewed sense of purpose. The painful experience with Jay becomes a chapter in your history rather than the explanation for your entire future. The message ends with a blessing for that future, asking heaven to surround you with abundance and joy as you continue forward. The spiritual war described throughout the transcript is declared finished. Person with the initial J is no longer presented as an active force in your destiny. What remains is your choice about where you place your attention now. You can continue looking backward, wondering what J is doing, why they acted the way they did, or whether they finally understand what they lost. Or you can recognize that the most important victory is not watching someone else fall. It is realizing that you no longer need them to fall in order for you to rise. But that is where this entire story ultimately leads. Your strength does not come from defeating another person, and your future does not depend on their punishment. It comes from reclaiming your attention, protecting your boundaries, learning from what happened, and refusing to allow someone else's behavior to determine the direction of your life. The chapter with Jay may have been painful, confusing, and exhausting, but it does not have to remain open forever. You can close it, carry the lessons forward, and leave the rest behind. So take the breath the message has been asking you to take from the beginning. Let the past remain where it belongs. Stop measuring your future through someone else's actions. And allow yourself to move forward with the peace you have been trying to find. The final words of the original message are simple. Walk forward in peace. Your new chapter begins when you decide that the old one no longer has the authority to define you.